Are you looking for a way to advertise your business, offer discounts to your customers, and help veterans at the same time? Then CityByHero.com is the answer. It's your shop local program helping you while providing jobs and funds for veterans. It's simple to sign up, easy for your clients to find your business and your offers, and there are many plans to choose from that fit your budget and your needs. Go to CityByHero.com and sign up today, and we'll make a donation for you to a veterans organization. CityByHero.com.
And now, it's time to Stand for Truth with the host of Stand for Truth Radio, Susan Knowles.
And welcome to the program, everyone. I'm your host, Susan Knowles. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd also ask that you would please check out my website at susanknowles.com and the articles that I write as a contributor to The Blaze and also to WND.com. And don't forget to follow Stand for Truth Radio in a segment I also do called Knowles on the News. Just go to Spreaker.com or download the Spreaker phone app, type in Susan Knowles, and follow the show there, and you'll receive all new updates as they happen. Now, Stand for Truth Radio is also on iTunes. You can look for us there and hear and download all the podcasts for free. Finally, you can also find me on my YouTube channel at Susan Knowles and at Susan Knowles on Twitter. Now, we have a great guest today. His name is Philip Haney. He's an author of the new book coming out tomorrow, as a matter of fact, May 24th. It's called See Something, Say Nothing. A Homeland Security Officer Exposes the Government's Submission to Jihad. So let me give you some information, and then we'll bring our guest on and get started. Philip Haney studied Arabic culture and language while working as a scientist in the Middle East before he was hired as the founding member of the Department of Homeland Security in 2003. Becoming an Armed Customs and Border Protection Officer, he served several tours of duty at the National Targeting Center near Washington, D.C., where he quickly was promoted to his Advanced Targeting Team, an unprecedented accomplishment for an agent on temporary duty assignment. Officer Haney won numerous awards and commendations from his superiors for meticulously compiling information and producing actionable reports that led to the identification of hundreds of terrorists. He has specialized in Islamic theology and the strategy and tactics of the global Islamic movement. He retired honorably in July of 2015. Welcome to the program, Philip Haney. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you very much, Susan. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I wanted to let you know, I read your book this weekend, and basically, wow is all I can say. After reading your book, See Something, Say Nothing, really, to me, it just confirms my worst fears about this administration, but a great book that you have coming out tomorrow.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would like people to know that there is hope in the story, too. But it's a very direct narrative of some of the major events that happened within the counterterrorism world just after 9/11, clear up to virtually real time. In fact, most of the stories that are in the book have not been resolved to this day. In other words, they're still ongoing. It's a live story, in other words, and many of the components have not been resolved yet.
Well, before we get started on that, and I do want to delve into the book quite a bit, I gave a background for you. Can you give us more about like a personal background for you, where you were raised perhaps, and how you ended up with the DHS?
I was born in California, and I grew up with an interest in science and languages. So all through school, I always studied languages, but I focused mainly on science. I went to the University of California at Davis to the Department of Entomology, which was my first degree, Bachelor of Science in Entomology. Then I went on to graduate school and got my master's and actually started in the PhD program, but then had to go back to work. We ran out of grant money. But in the meantime, I worked in places all over the world, foreign countries, in virtually every continent except for Australia. And I specialized in ants. the ants in agriculture. And that's the connection between what I did in science and what I eventually ended up doing in counterterrorism.
Wow, you wouldn't think there's a connection there. So it's pretty amazing.
Well, there's actually a very direct connection. Two qualities of a good entomologist is careful attention to detail and close observation of behavior. Mm-hmm. Because all living creatures have behavior patterns, which if you observe them carefully, you can almost always determine a biologically based way of controlling them if they're a pest, or enhancing them if they're some of the good bugs. Right. So you combine those two qualities together, attention to detail and observation of behavior, with the fact that I specialized in ants, and as I say, you follow the trail and find the nest, and then push reset and do it again. That's counterterrorism. Follow the trail, find the nest.
And hope that your government allows you to do what you should do when you find the nest. I mean, that's kind of what I got out of your book.
Well, that's what they kept basically insisting, there is no nest.
Yeah.
That these random acts of violence, which I call the random ants of violence, are not connected, as though ants themselves have no home to go to. They're just out wandering around, foraging on their own, which, of course, we all know is not the case. In fact, ants cannot survive for more than a few hours if they're separated from the rest of the colony. And that's the part we're missing, is the fact that these individuals are part of groups, which are part of organizations, which is part of an entire global network. And they all have exactly the same strategy.
Well, you talk about in your book, too, and we all know this, that the Obama administration has always had a really hard time naming our enemies. They don't want to talk about radical Islam, or it's so hard for them to even say that, and they say ISIL instead of ISIS for various reasons. But I know it didn't all start there. According to your book, you talk about it starting under Bush. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure, but I would also like to make the point that President Obama acknowledged that he did know the true nature of the threat. Interview that was published in the Atlantic magazine a month or so ago. His statement was that he did understand the nature of the threat, the jihad threat, but chose not to discuss it in public because he did not want to precipitate any latent xenophobic reactions, aka Islamophobia, within the American culture. So he chose not to discuss it in public.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess that's what we really kind of assumed that he was doing all along. But and you talk about some of those things in your book too. But how did it start under Bush? What was that?
Well, the first time I slammed into the wall of an investigation was in March of 2006. I wrote an article that was posted on a front page magazine website called Green Tide Rising. Hamas ascends. That was right at the point when they had elections in the West Bank and Gaza, and the people in Gaza voted Hamas to be their leaders. So I wrote a commentary on it of what had been up to that point, what was occurring at the moment in history, and then looking into the future. It's still available on the web, but if you go and read it, search it out, you'll see that it looks like it was written 5 minutes ago, not 10 years ago. But I was investigated. I took a class, one of my training class, that was run by contract CIA officers. So I gave them a copy of the article, thinking, of course, that we'd be the most interested in reading it. But I was wrong, because I ended up being investigated, and the charge was unethical use of classified information. They assumed that I couldn't have written the article unless I had access to classified information, and therefore I violated ethics of use of classified by putting it on a public website. That was the first of 9 times that I was investigated by my own administration for simply upholding the vow that we took to protect our country from threat, both foreign and domestic.
So I guess they thought that was going to be what they needed to do in order to silence you. I mean, that would be my guess, right?
Well, it remains a mystery to this day, really, why they would investigate me for writing an article about Hamas. Because it was already a globally designated terrorist organization, had been since actually before 9/11, and yet that's exactly what happened.
Well,
they didn't ask me how I came to my conclusions. They just assumed that I had based it on unethical use of classified information.
Yeah. And I don't know, I view that, all of that, and when people do that, when the government does that they're trying to stop you because you're getting too close to the truth and they don't like it. I mean, that would be my assumption on it. So, but like you said, you don't know, what they're going to come up with.
No.
You also mentioned there was an initiative called See Something, Say Something, which was a directive at the DHS, and I'm sure that's how you got your title of your book, See Something, Say Nothing. Can you talk a little bit about that campaign and what some of the Muslim groups were saying about the campaign?
Initially, the individuals, the leaders of some of the Muslim Brotherhood front groups that are operating in the United States that were proven in the Holy Land Foundation trial to be direct supporters of Hamas financially, they were brought into the administration to provide advice and counsel on both foreign and domestic counterterrorism policy. And that became what eventually was known as the See Something, Say Something campaign. It's also that See Something, Say Something campaign is under a larger umbrella of what is called countering violent extremism. That whole, we call it CVE. The whole CVE policy was a movement away from law enforcement, fact-based analysis version of counterterrorism into a civil rights and civil liberties engagement and dialogue approach to counterterrorism. And to answer the last part of your question, in the last few months, the very same Muslim Brotherhood organizations and their leaders have come out and publicly renounced the CVE program as being ineffective, discriminatory, and stigmatizing.
Well,
yeah.
and you had a lot of work in the organization with CARE. They came out and they didn't like things, right?
CARE was one of them. They tend to be in the up front in the media, gaining attention that way. Like after the San Bernardino shootings, they came out immediately. The first thing they said it was our fault. Our foreign policy is what led to the attacks in San Bernardino. And as a law enforcement officer, an intelligence officer with a specialty in this subject, that sitting there as an active duty officer, watching these organizations grab airtime and take control of the narrative with the help and cooperation of the administration is very surreal, because we know that these groups and these individuals have derogatory information and that they should have actually been shut down a long time ago. To see them have such an inordinate influence in terms of our domestic and foreign policy the word astonishing is inadequate. It's
right.
Surreal. Mm-hmm.
Well, and you talk about in your book about how they wanted you to change different things in training manuals. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, my particular point of contact with their policy was I was ordered to modify a large number of records in the system that we use, our law enforcement system, which would otherwise be known as the dots. We hear a lot about connecting the dots.
Right.
Well, this information that I put into the system, and colleagues like me, was particularly focused on the Muslim Brotherhood. And the directive from headquarters for me to modify the information in the system came beginning in October of 2009, which is an entire year after the Holy Land Foundation trial was completed with guilty verdicts for overt support of Hamas, which means that they knew, in spite of the irrefutable evidence presented in federal court, when they ordered me to take that information out that related to Muslim Brotherhood, they made a conscious decision right there that they were going to disregard facts-based law enforcement information in order to pursue their policy of engagement in dialogue based on a civil rights and civil liberties approach to counterterrorism. They knew, and yet they still did it. In fact, everything that's happened since November of 2008, you could say they know, because the evidence is there. It's just whether they have chosen to act on it or not.
And when you were ordered to take that information out, did they tell you specifically, we were asking you to remove this because, and what did they say to you?
They say that we didn't have the authority to put the information in there in the first place.
Unbelievable. And I'm wondering, why didn't your bosses just take that information out themselves without involving you and other people to remove that information?
Well, it's the cardinal rule of intelligence, as in science and research, is you don't remove intelligence information, especially if it's not your own.
Right.
You don't change results. You don't modify information. That's a cardinal rule because it takes time. Collection of information, small little bits all put together, like pixels in a picture, for you to see the picture. But if you're not putting the pixels in, you're never going to see the picture. That's what the dots are. So,
well, I mean, it makes sense, and I understand it, because let's say medical records, you're not allowed to go in and change anybody else's records, but you're also not allowed to go in and change something that's truthful. You know, you can amend it and you can put in something else, but you're really never supposed to take those things out. And I would imagine even if you didn't have quote unquote permission to put it in, they could have done an amendment and said, you know, we didn't find this wasn't valid, or we haven't researched this, or something, rather than having you take it out. It's so suspicious that information was just deleted.
Yes, I believe, and I maintain strongly that it's because it had direct connection to the Muslim Brotherhood organizations that the administration was courting as allies in their domestic and foreign policy. So They had to make a choice whether to act on the derogatory information that was in the system and build on it like putting bricks in a wall, or to not merely passively ignore it, which is what they did initially, but then to deliberately and intentionally remove it entirely. And that's what they chose to do. We hear a lot of examples lately of modifying, deleting, changing of information. It just so happens that I was one of the first subject matter experts working within the federal government that this happened to. But I was by no means the last. I just happened to be one of the first.
That's just unbelievable. And did anybody try at that point to go to Congress or go to someone, if there is a someone to go to and say, hey, look, they're trying to make us delete this information?
I went myself to Congress 45 times in a space of 4 years, trying to tell them what was going on within the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection in the world that I lived in. I tried to notify them, and I showed them evidence of what was going on 45 times. I did not want to be like Edward Snowden, who went to the media and released the information to the public arena. I wanted to follow every possible chain of command procedure and do my utmost to present the information within the channels that are provided for us. But on the other hand, there is no room 243 that you can go to and fill out a couple of forms and make an appointment to come back next week when you become a whistleblower. There is no process to the process. You are essentially on your own, and you assume great risk when you do it.
Well, in reading your book, it seemed like some of the Congress people, the Congress members, were very open and helpful to you. And I loved how in the book they kept saying to you, "Boy, you need some protection." But it's like it seems like they never gave it to you, but they sure knew that you needed it.
Well, that was a moment of clarity when you're sitting right next to somebody. I mean, literally, in their office in a chair, side by side, looking at a computer screen on a table, face to face, turning toward each other, looking them eye to eye. That level of familiarity and emotional contact, I saw it in chairmen of committees and well-known congressmen that you see on the news quite frequently. They knew. It was obvious to them that there was a problem and that something should be done. And you're right. I can't tell you how many times people said I should be protected and that the information should also be protected. And although there were people all along the way who did what they could, in the end, to this day, there hasn't been an actual investigation on any of the allegations that I've brought forward in all the years that I came to Congress.
And it's so sad because, I mean, the truth of the matter is it looks like, as with other things, that it will never be investigated. There's no time within this administration. And maybe 10, 20 years down the road, somebody will say, hey, did you know that this happened and this wasn't good? I mean, it's kind of like the Kennedy assassination. Years later, there'll be a theory about it, conspiracy theory, and it'll be the same thing with this. And it'll be too late for what we needed to know now.
That's one of the reasons why books are so important, even in this modern era, especially in light of all the modification and deletion. Look at the whole problem with the emails. Every time we turn around, there's large caches of emails that just suddenly disappear. Well, the book will stand on its own. Even if all that other information somehow disappeared overnight, there will be the book with a very straightforward narrative that what happened between 9/11 and when I retired in 2015, it's right there. Every major big event that happened, the Boston bombing, the Chattanooga shootings, the San Bernardino events, immigration policy, involvement with the Muslim Brotherhood, Benghazi, all of these key points along the trajectory that got us from 9/11 to where we are today are documented in the book.
Well, and you're right. You absolutely need something that's in hard form, unless they burn the books, which nothing surprises me anymore. But that you need something there. Electronically, things can be removed, and your book is a wealth of information. And you sit there and you read the book, and you can't believe that. I mean, you can't believe, and on the other hand, you can believe, because of so many things that happened in the past, that nothing has been done, that people haven't been brought, to justice on all of this. But we're simply losing our ability to do that under this administration. I wanted to ask you too. You talk about some VIP tours with the CARE members. Can you talk about that?
That was in Chicago in the year 2006. And that was one of the first, that's what I call when the submarine comes up out of the water. You start to realize that there has been something down there under the surface for quite some time. And at that time, in 2006, it has not been proven yet that CARE was irrefutably linked to the support of Hamas. The Holy Land trial took care of that and proved it. Yet, for people inside the law enforcement community like myself, we were very well aware of the true nature of CARE, because it had been founded initially by two members, direct operatives of Hamas operating here in the United States. And it was monitored by the FBI in 1993. So they knew since 1993, which is 13 years beforehand, these individuals were founding members of the organization which eventually became known as Council on American Islamic Relations, which is basically an aggressive PR firm for the Muslim Brotherhood organization in the United States. Their main job is to distract people from what's really the deeper level strategic and tactical goals of the Muslim Brotherhood by filing civil lawsuits against the federal government and getting a lot of face time in the media as posing as a civil rights and civil liberties organization, when in fact they're operatives for the larger Muslim Brotherhood network, operating not only in the United States but around the world.
And let's talk a little bit now about the Boston bombing. How much did the Obama administration know in advance of the Boston Marathon bombing?
Well, 4 years before the bombing occurred in April of 2013, I put an analysis into the same law enforcement system that I referred to earlier, and I tied together a network of organizations and individuals with the central hub of the Islamic Society of Boston. And I would just like the listening audience to guess how many times in that 4-year period between 2009, when I first put the records in, and the Boston bombing in 2013, how many times were those records queried by people other than myself?
Wow.
The answer is 0. Would you like to guess how many times those same records were queried in the hours, days, and weeks after the Boston bombing?
Same amount?
Same answer, 0. And you have to assume that the law enforcement officers and intelligence subject matter experts within my agency and other affiliated agencies were aware of those records. But that's a passive action, just not querying. But what they did subsequently was brought the Islamic Society of Boston into the Countering Violent Extremism program as a model community, knowing full well if they did any even simple level vetting that the organization, ISB, the Islamic Society of Boston, had a large number of individuals and affiliated organizations with known ties to terrorism. But they chose Boston as one of their model communities, along with Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Los Angeles. But the day before the CVE summit in February of 2014, the Imam of the ISB came out and publicly renounced the program and said again it was discriminatory, ineffective, and stigmatizing to the Muslim community. This is the model community leader that said that in public. And then he went on to say if the ISB was radical, then the different law enforcement agencies like DHS, FBI, and CBP would not have been cooperating with me for the last 4 years.
Oh, wow.
Which told me right there the reason why no one queried the records. They weren't investigating the ISB. They were doing community outreach and dialogue with them and selected them as a model community. That is the kind of story behind the story that the American public needs to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell us a little bit about that whole lawsuit with Glenn Beck and the person who, I think it was the same person that Michelle Obama visited in the hospital after the Boston bombing, and then he subsequently kind of disappeared. Can you talk about that?
Well, not only did President Obama's wife, Michelle, visit him and others, we should add that, in the hospital in the hours after the bombing. Subsequently, the most important part was Janet Napolitano's testimony before the House Committee on Homeland Security Vice Chairman Jeff Duncan on the 18th of April 2013, basically 4 days after the bombing. At that point when she testified in a public hearing, we still didn't know about the Tsarnaev brothers. No one had actually been identified. There was only one person who was suspected of being involved, and that was this person, Al-Harbi, That's his last name. He's a Saudi young man, about 20, 21 years old, that was at the scene of the bombing. Initially, she insisted to Jeff Duncan that there was no subject of interest, no person of interest, and no Saudi citizen who was scheduled to be deported. That wasn't true. He was a subject of interest, he was a person of interest, and he was scheduled to be deported. And the reason why I knew all that is that was my job at the National Targeting Center. So I knew how to look up information. And why did I look it up? Because I had nexus to the case. The very same records that I referred to earlier regarding the Islamic Society of Boston that I put in 4 years earlier gave me law enforcement nexus to the case, which meant I was doing just exactly what every other cop in the country was doing, trying to help solve the case before something else bad happened. And that's why I found out about it. And that was a great moral dilemma. What do you do when your own boss, the Secretary of DHS, represents the facts of the case in a public hearing before the Vice Chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security? What would you do in a case like that?
That's a difficult, very difficult situation, because she could always say, well, I didn't lie. I didn't have all of the information. I mean, that seems to be what the Obama administration says when they get caught in something. Well, I just didn't have all the information yet, and now we can go back and amend our records, and I'll get those to you. And then I don't know if the records ever come, but that seems to be the standard line. So that's a.
If that's what she did, it would have been a simple solution to the dilemma. She could have said a lot of things. She could have said, actually, yes, that was the case, but X, Y, and Z events have intervened, and we've made a different decision. I'd like to talk to you about it, but let's go on sidebar, off the record, in a private setting, and I'll explain it to you. That's all she had to do. But that's not what she did. And then 4 days later, before Darrell Issa, on the Senate side, she said the same thing again. She had an opportunity to amend it, but she didn't. She insisted once again. Although she did concede that he was on the watch list, which is more than she would admit in her first testimony with Jeff Duncan. So by the time you got done listening to all the comments, I don't blame anyone for being confused by the contradictory statements that she made, which of course makes you wonder if it was deliberate. I don't know, but from a law enforcement officer's perspective, somebody who's supposed to have the ability and the command of the agency she's secretary of, you would think that she should know what the actual facts of the case were. Right.
But we also allow the president to say, I haven't seen it on the news yet, so I don't know. So we as a that's even crazier than what she said. So that doesn't surprise me. But also, when Glenn Beck was sued, and he's still going through that lawsuit because he made allegations about that Saudi, right? The Saudi Arabia guy.
And that's a different subject, meaning from my perspective as a law enforcement officer, I never made any assumptions or assertions about that individual's involvement. All I simply had was the evidence that he was, in fact, a person of interest, a subject of interest, and initially scheduled to be deported. That's all I ever said. I never made any subsequent assertions about his involvement. I simply provided the information that we had created as a law enforcement agency to the committee because they asked for it. But I never made any subsequent assertions. And that's essentially what the case is about. But what's also important to recognize is that he's a foreign national. He's not an American citizen. Why is he being allowed to sue an American citizen on what is essentially a freedom of speech issue? He's suing Glenn Beck for slander, but he's a foreign national. And I'd like the people in the audience to think about that for a minute. What kind of a precedent will that set if we can be sued by foreign nationals for saying things in particular about him as a person and or the religion of Islam? What kind of precedent is that going to set for people who make statements in public like me right now in the future if this case does not get resolved in favor of the Constitution, the freedom of speech?
Yeah, and this may have to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and hopefully when it gets there, if it has to go that far, because it seems like they're not letting it go. And it's on its way to one day going there, I guess, that somebody up there will say, hey, is this not constitutional? It never was, never should have been brought, and out it goes. But who knows? I mean, and after all that time.
You know the most surreal aspect of the whole case?
What's that?
Is according to Janet Napolitano et al., he doesn't even exist.
So he doesn't exist, but he gets filed
by a person that supposedly doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Because the way she framed her answers, there was no Saudi individual who was ever considered a suspect or a person of interest.
Right.
And there was never a Saudi individual who was ever going to be deported with any relation to the case whatsoever. So Glenn Beck is being sued by a person that, in one sense, doesn't exist, but he does exist.
It makes sense in this upside down world that we're suddenly finding ourselves in. You know, that's the only way it makes sense. I wanted to ask you too, moving on a little bit from the Boston Marathon, about the Words Matter memo. Tell us about that.
That's a shorthand term for a document that was released initially for internal evaluation, including specialists like myself. It got sent up the chain of command or down the chain of command for review. It's actually called Terminology to Define Terrorism. It has a long title, but the first two words in the memo are Words Matter. And it's still available on the web today. Anyone can go and find it. It was published January of 2008. I mentioned earlier about the emerging submarine allegory. This is another emerging submarine. This is the first time when people like myself inside the law enforcement community began to realize that this policy that eventually became known as countering violent extremism began to emerge up out of the administrative ocean, if you will. And we were asked to evaluate it, which I did. I provided 7 points of evaluation showing why this Words Matter approach would be detrimental to the law enforcement community, and send it up the chain of command. And I'm sure you won't be surprised to find out that I never got a response from anyone up the chain of command regarding the concerns that I raised. And even though we were assured that it was only for review and not considered for official policy, guess what? It became official policy.
Jeez, unbelievable. Well, you know, also I want to talk a little bit about Hillary Clinton. You wrote about her in the book See Something, Say Nothing, about a person that she had contact with, Tariq Ramadan. Can you tell us who he is and what she did in connection with him?
Tariq Ramadan is the grandson of the founder of Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna. And he lives in Europe. And he was, for quite some time, refused admission to the United States because of his connection with known terrorist group. Either it was affiliation direct or it was financial. I don't honestly remember which. But in the early days of DHS, and especially post 9/11, just the affiliation with either a person or an organization with known ties to terrorism would be enough for you to be refused a visa. And that was the basis for his visa refusal. So what happened was that Janet Napolitano and Hillary Clinton both issued a statement issuing him a waiver, allowing him to apply for a visa and come back into the United States to speak at large conventions held by groups like the Islamic Society of North America or the Islamic Circle of North America. The grandson of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood came to America after being refused admission on a terrorist affiliation charge that was overridden with law enforcement discretion by Janet Napolitano and Hillary Clinton, DHS Secretary and Secretary of State, and that's what they did. They gave him a waiver. And that kind of set off a chain reaction of similar kinds of law enforcement discretion decisions. That wasn't the first one, and it wasn't the last one either.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about her top aide, Huma Abedin. What is her connection that you know of with the Muslim Brotherhood? And at one point, I guess there was supposed to be an investigation. What happened with all that?
Well, her parents, her father and mother, are both very active leaders in the Muslim Brotherhood organization in their home country. And you're probably referring to the letter that 5 members of Congress wrote to, I believe it was 5 inspector generals of 5 different law enforcement branches of the government, the DHS, DOJ, FBI, a couple other ones that I'm not looking at it right now. But the bottom line is they wrote a letter of inquiry and concern to the inspector general of each one of these branches of the government, not accusing, but asking, don't you think it would be a good idea to look into the background, not only of Huma Abedin, but of these other organizations that were already named in the Holy Land Foundation trial as known affiliates and supporters of Hamas? And of course, some of the listeners will remember there was a huge storm that erupted on Capitol Hill that June of 2012 over these letters. And even some members of the Republican Party threw Michelle Obama in particular under the bus. Rather than just honestly addressing the concerns and questions that were in the letter, it turned into a huge fiasco. And none of the concerns were ever addressed at any appreciable level by any of the inspector generals of those 5 different agencies. But if we look back now, 4 years later, it's very obvious that they were right in their assertions. So it really does make you wonder what was motivating the people who publicly criticized people like Michelle Bachmann and Louis Gohmert, Trent Franks, Lynn Westmoreland, and one other representative from Florida who signed the letters and sent them forward. All they were doing was their duty.
Right.
As representatives. It was up to the IG to determine whether their claims were valid or not other representatives of the Congress who intervened in the entire process and made a public spectacle out of the whole event.
Well, it wasn't John McCain and John Boehner, weren't they two specifically that stand out in my mind of who were against any investigation?
Yep, they were.
Yeah.
With the MB front groups cheering on the sidelines, they came out and publicly, or I should say made public statements, essentially severely criticizing, in particular, Michelle Bachmann, but by default, the rest of them now as well. Mm-hmm. It would have been a lot simpler for them just to say, let's forward the letters, let the IG do their job, let them make an honest evaluation, and we'll go from there. Of course, I was still active duty at the time, and I was very well informed and very familiar with the individuals and the organizations that were referenced in those 5 letters. So I knew full well the level of derogatory information that actually existed on those individuals. So I actually saw respected leaders of our country discredit themselves in public, because I can promise you that looking back, History has a very fierce eye. And when history fastens her eye, her unblinking eye on you, if you're on the wrong side of history.
Yeah. Well, and you wonder if some of these people, the reason they, I don't want to name names, but I'll name names, that they go through so much where they basically, you can't tell the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans at times. Like John Boehner is one person I'm talking about, and what he's gone through, and it's almost like he's breaking down. You just wonder, how much does he know? How much has he done? We can see, in public, how he has basically done everything that the Obama administration wants him to do as when he was Speaker of the House. So you have to figure out then how much regret is he going to have, if any. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But after a while, like you said, are you on the right side or the wrong side of history? And that would be, I think, a lot of people's questions for John Boehner and John McCain too, in a lot of ways.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I sat face to face, side by side with any number of representatives, both on the Senate and the House side. I know without question that in those moments of clarity, they got the big picture.
Yeah.
They did know. I saw it in the most intimate human way, face to face. No cameras, no PR shots, no posing. It was real. They saw it, and they knew. And yet, for whatever combination of reasons, which I hope eventually we will understand, they made choices to not engage.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons, they made choices to, let's just wait a while, or whatever combinations that they used, or whatever combination of reasons that they had for doing it. But now we've come to the point where we're in an election cycle, and as I said, things are going to come more clear in the next few months, and I really do hope that everybody involved that's discussed on either side of the political fence finds the wherewithal to help our country recover itself and get back on track, define our borders, and start protecting ourselves, because no one in the listening audience leaves home and leaves their front door wide open. If you did that, people would say you're at cruise loose.
Right.
But why do we do it as a country? And why are people who are simply saying we should lock our front door and put a guard at the door, so to speak, or a security system around our house, why are those people attacked as if they're conspiracy theorists and bigots and Islamophobes? No one is saying stop immigration permanently. They're saying we already recognize we have a serious problem in our vetting process. Let's find a way to improve it before we just continue charging blindly ahead. It's kind of like driving with a blind spot in your mirror. What's the inevitable consequence of driving with a blind spot in your mirror if you refuse to acknowledge that there's a blind spot?
Exactly.
You're going to careen into somebody eventually.
Eventually, yep. And all of this, I think, Philip, is it's the progressive left in the agenda, and I think everybody knows that. Everybody knows that when people say things like we need to close the borders, and with what Donald Trump said about the Muslims coming over, people know exactly what he meant by that, and they want to make something out of it because it fits their agenda to do so, and they're continuing to do that. And what we do need, you're right, we need leadership, people who want to go into the office of the president and into Congress, who are actually going to do their jobs, not be bought off by whomever, whatever organization. Not saying that they are, but I'm just saying people can kind of look at that and say something's going on. And we need to get back to the principles of this country and saving this country. And I think your book brings up a whole lot of things where we know we have to clean house.
Well, when people talk about closing the border, if you were to ask them about it 2 or 3 different times, I think eventually they would all settle on the recognition of the fact that it's not so much closing the border, it's securing the border.
Right.
The border needs to be secure. It's not a question of closing it like slamming a door. But even if we had a wall 90 feet tall all the way around the entire country, it wouldn't keep us safe if there's no one watching the gate.
Yes, true.
And that's really what it's all about. The people that took a vow to watch the gate are not allowed to do their jobs effectively. We've been handcuffed by policy. And anyone that you were able to talk to, sit down with a one-on-one from ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or Border Patrol, or CBP, or FBI, or any other branch of law enforcement, they would all tell you exactly the same thing. We're capable of doing our jobs and fulfilling our vow, but we're handcuffed and we're not allowed to do it because of present policy.
Mm-hmm.
You would find exactly the same story in virtually every single person you talk to if they were able to answer you honestly.
And I think, too, this is just my opinion, but if you elect Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, you're going to get more of the same. And if you elect Hillary Clinton, you're going to get probably 5 times more of what you're seeing now in this administration. It's going to be so bad that you wouldn't even believe that, you'd be looking at the Obama administration and thinking, well, wait, maybe it wasn't so bad after all, when you get her in there. That's just my opinion.
Well, they've already established a precedent. There's really not much of a question what they would do because you can see what they have already done.
Right.
And that's a certainty. And you're right. If they receive the mandate from the American public and assume the White House, whatever restraint exists now will diminish significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And they will see people who oppose them as legitimate targets for civil action, meaning civil protests and or legal action for basically hindering the national security of our country by standing up and opposing the narrative. We've seen precedents set. We're almost at the point where ordinary political dialogue is a thing of the past. It's like we virtually never actually have an honest conversation about any of the problems that we face. It always turns into diatribes, ad hominem attacks, and we virtually never address the nature of the threat we really face. Whereas with the other side, there are uncertainties simply because of the person's, the fact that he's never been in a political office. However, the arena that he operates in is also a precedent. You can see by the way he manages his business affairs that he's very likely going to apply that same approach to the presidency. And above all of that, to me it's a simple question. Who is more likely to stand up and defend the Constitution? Of the 2 candidates, which one is more likely, based on past behavior and precedent, to stand up and to defend the Constitution? To me, that simplifies the choice in the election significantly, because by past action and precedent, we already know who is more likely to stand up and defend the inalienable rights that we have been endowed with by our Creator.
Right. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We know that Hillary Clinton is not going to do anything. She'll change her mind like she did on marriages between a man and a woman. She was so for that, and then she's totally the opposite now. So we know she says one thing and then does another. She's always been that way and always will be. She's not going to change. She may get worse, but I don't think there's any chance of her getting better. But
Well, from my
hopefully.
perspective, again, as a law enforcement officer, I watched her lead what is called the Istanbul process. The Istanbul process, which culminated in the passage of what is called UN Resolution 1618, which essentially criminalizes criticism of Islam on a global level.
Yeah, right.
Anybody that comes out and says something slanderous or derogatory, which, by the way, in Islam can even include the truth,
right,
will be brought before a tribunal and charged with defamation of Islam.
right.
And it's a serious crime. And Hillary Clinton, during her tenure as Secretary of State, led the Istanbul process, which then culminated in the passage of UN Resolution 1618. For me, along with her activities in Benghazi,
Right.
those precedents right there answer the question for me of who would be more likely to stand up and defend constitutional values like the First Amendment, freedom of speech.
Right, and Second Amendment.
I thought it was intriguing, the argument about the missing 28 pages vis-a-vis the Saudi possible involvement in 9/11. And one of the concerns that the president voiced was it might allow foreign nationals to sue us if we sue them. The fact is it's already happening.
Right.
Meaning the Al Harvey trial with Glenn Beck.
Exactly.
It's already here. It's already in process now. So
right.
that is not that argument doesn't hold water because it's already happening.
It's already happening. Well, and Philip Haney, I'm going to have to leave it there because we're running out of time. Thank you so much for coming on today. Your book, See Something, Say Nothing, is out tomorrow. Everybody can go to Amazon and get it, right?
That's right.
Okay, perfect. Well, I wish you good luck with that book. I think everybody needs to go out and buy that book, pre-order it today, and get that book because you do want to have something that you can keep and hold on to, and you'll know exactly, you'll connect the dots even more than you already know. Okay, so Philip, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, take care.
You too.
Thank you. Yeah, I tell you, that book will just make your head spin and your eyes roll back in your head. You know a lot, but when you read that book, we barely touched on what's in that book. When you read that book, you're just going to say, what do we do? And it's almost like now that when anything else is said or done, after you read this book, you'll just realize that if the lips are moving on people, certain people, you know it's a lie, and you should not believe it. And then you'll wonder, who is it now that I really can trust? And the answer to that is, you know what? I don't know. Because I'll tell you, a lot of the things I read in there about when he went to Congress, and like he said, 45 times going to Congress, and still nothing was happening, which tells you their hands are just as tied as everybody else's. Or they're involved in, whatever it is that keeps them from doing their job and representing the United States as they have sworn that they will do. But that's also something that the President of the United States swears as well, that they will uphold the Constitution and protect the United States. So I tell you, go out and get that book. See Something, Say Nothing. I'm sure that you will enjoy it as much as I did, and I thank Philip Haney for coming on today. I also thank you very much for coming here and being with us each week on Stand for Truth Radio. Next week is Memorial Day, so we're going to have probably not a guest. It'll either be me or a past show, but you'll love it either way. Have a happy Memorial Day. If I don't talk to you before then, God bless you. Take care of yourself. We'll see you soon.
Hi, I'm Susan Knowles. Do you often feel that our world is upside down, where fiction has become fact and America seems to be unrecognizable? Then you'll want to read my fiction, Freedom's Fight, A Call to Remember. Go on a journey with Bethany, who longs for the country she once knew, before the regime took over and changed it beyond recognition. Go with her on her quest to return America to its rightful place. Order Freedom's Fight, A Call to Remember at Amazon.com today.